Hello everybody, this is Hammer Striker here. Today I want to talk about safeties a little bit, how they work, how they've evolved different guns. What I've got here is a Ruger Mark IV Standard, and the Mark series have been around for a long time, and they kind of look a lot like a German Luger. These are more meant for fun, varminting, things like this. This is not really designed to be, holster carried as a defensive weapon. I mean, you could. But the design intent of these is more in places where the gun is going to be being handled only when it's ready to fire. You're going to be fired and not necessarily used in a defensive. So they're a little lighter on safeties in some areas and some additional safeties that you may or may not agree is a safety. These have a magazine disconnect, the various different Mark series. And what that means is if the magazine's not in it, you can't fire it. They don't have internal drop safeties, and they have a 1911-ish style safety. It operates in the opposite direction. But in that case, because of the design intent of these, and there's other guns in this category like it, where you're starting to get into target pistols, competition pistols, and things like that, they tend to have fewer safeties. If you're going to carry these or any of those in that variety, consider that fact. That doesn't make them bad guns necessarily. It just means that they don't have additional safety features that would make them fit for that purpose. Now I'm going to move into the modern world, the polymer wonders, and I've got a few of them that I'll bring out on the table. So what I've got here is the current generation of polymer wonders. Polymer being that the frames on all of these are some variation of a polymer, and they usually have, of course, they have steel slides. Some of them will have a polymer jacket around the slide, like the 5.7, but the parts that handle the actual firing of the round have to be steel or they won't work. But it makes them lighter, and as you can see, like from the P365, you can get really small and still have decent capacity. This holds 10 rounds plus one in the pipe. All of these are meant to be carried and used with a chambered round. So they have multiple redundant safeties that are intended to do that. And some of the safety features on these are misunderstood. Some of the safety features on these are just, you don't even think about them, they're just there. Now, I'm not going to say that Glock was the first or the best of the polymer wonders, but it was the first wildly commercially successful one. H&K came out with a polymer wonder at one point, but it just didn't take off. Glock in the mid-80s, they came out with the Glock 17, and their marketing was pretty amazing, and it was marketing that drove the gun. It gave a lot of them away to police forces and stuff like that. But let's talk about the safeties on these. All of these are considered to be drop safe by design. There's some opinions as to whether or not they're fully drop safe. SIG with the P320 has gotten some bad press with this one, and even their modification, there's still some argument as to whether the modification is safe, and I'll talk about why when we get into talking about the various features. So one of the most misunderstood features of the polymer wonders is this little toggle, and what's that do? And as you see, when I push on it, it's moving. And if I tilt the gun up, it might be hard to see. Right now, that base of that toggle, and I'm going to move it again so you can see it, that base of that toggle is actually aimed at the frame. So if I try to pull the trigger with the side of my finger, I'm grabbing it from underneath and I'm deliberately not catching that toggle, I hit the frame. What that does is prevents the trigger from being pulled unless the toggle is pushed in, at which point the trigger can move. There's a lot of confusion about what that's for. What that is for is to eliminate inertial pulls. If you drop something, all of it accelerates due to gravity, and when it hits, the part that actually physically hits will stop. Anything that is not physically attached via a hard mechanism, its own mass will keep it moving. And that's what seatbelts do in a car. Your car hits something, your body is not part of the frame of the car, so it keeps moving. So the seatbelts attach you to the frame of the car and try to keep you from flying out the windshield. Well, what this does is it makes it where if the gun is dropped, butt down, so as it's coming down and it hits, and the frame of the gun stops, the trigger can't keep moving from its own weight. So that prevents the trigger from disengaging all the internal safeties, because that's the key to these polymer wonders. All of the safeties are internal. They're deactivated by the mere act of pulling the trigger. So unlike the 1911 and some others where you actually have to take an action to thumb a safety off, or you have to have, pull the trigger in a double action mode to cock the mechanism, The mechanisms are mostly ready to go on these, and it's the trigger pull that finalizes it. If you block the trigger pull, all the other safeties stay operational. That's where SIG got in trouble. To avoid patents and stuff like that, and or just their own engineers' decisions, they opted not to put that toggle on the trigger. So they're relying on the safeties and the mass of the trigger to prevent an inertial pull. Well, unfortunately, the trigger was a little bit too heavy, and there were instances of them dropping and hitting, and the trigger having enough mass to disengage the internal safeties, and they'd fire. And that created quite a fiasco for the P320, which resulted in an upgrade. They actually didn't call it a recall, they called it an upgrade, where they modified the fire control group, lightened up the trigger in an attempt to solve that. And they have stuck with that mechanism for going forward to like the P365, but this gun has all of the upgrades that were done to the P320 right from the factory. There's still some churn about that, but some of that, I haven't seen a lot of it based with facts, but we did have an incident here in Florida where an officer was carrying a P320 and was near a wall, and he smacked it into the wall and the gun went off. It was in a school, and nobody was hurt. It basically scared everybody, but nobody was hurt. Now, I never was able to get the facts because, being an agency, they kind of hide the facts of whether that particular gun had the upgrade or not. But conceptually, there's a case where the lack of a single component of the safety system may make the safety system less effective. Now, the XDM, made by Springfield, they have the toggle, but they see your toggle and they raise you a grip safety, which you saw in the 1911. So now it's not only is it that the trigger has to be pulled, but the grip safety has to be depressed. When I get a firing grip, the grip safety depresses automatically, and then I put my finger on the trigger and the action happens. So they are really adding to the whole thing. Now, if I don't have the grip safety engaged, even if I push the toggle, I can't pull the trigger and I can't fire the weapon, and I can't even cycle it. So like in 1911, where the thumb safety blocks the side, the grip safety will block the slide on an XDM. So that can be a little frustrating until you learn it when you go to take one apart, because you might be inclined to try to do something like this. You actually have to have the grip safety depressed. With the grip safety depressed, I can actually pull the trigger and fire the weapon. One of the other features I'm going to show you, and in order to do that, I've got a disassembled Glock here. Now, Glock mechanism, each company has their own slightly different mechanism for doing this, but the Glock is a reasonable representation of how they all work. There's a plunger here, and this plunger is the striker block. And if it's a striker gun, if it's a firing pin based gun, it's a firing pin block, conceptually the same thing. And when I push that down, it will move a notch out of the way and allow the striker to go all the way forward. There's a shoulder on the striker, so at this point, if I try to push the striker forward, so I'm going to cock the gun, so the striker is now cocked, I can't push it forward. But if I push down this piston, I can now push the striker all the way forward. So what that does is it prevents the striker from hitting the primer, regardless of anything, as long as the trigger is not pulled. Now, different guns will move this to the midship position or back here. So the XDMs have them at the back. As far as where it is on the line, it's unimportant. They're fundamentally all the same concept. And I'm going to use a Glock fire control group because they're the simplest, but all of them conceptually have the same concept. This is the trigger bar part of the sear, and this notch at the back, right here where my thumbnail is, right there, is the part that interacts with the striker. You see there's a little shelf. So it's going to hit here, and as you pull the trigger, it's going to move up and allow it to flick out of the way. When this is in the trigger forward position, like this, it's very high up and it can't be pushed down. So it's riding very, very close to the body of the frame. There's probably a 1/4 inch of metal, maybe not a 1/4 inch, but close, between freedom and this mechanism. So it basically fully blocks the firing pin or striker while it's in that position, and as you pull the trigger, it moves back. Now what it's doing there is it's actually starting to finish the cocking sequence. If I can do it. It's finishing the cocking sequence, adding a little bit more energy, So in a Glock and others like it, the striker is not even fully cocked. There's not even enough energy if it got free to fire the round. And as you pull the trigger, you add that energy. And if you decide not to and you start to let go, it would go back again. So you have a partially cocked. Now, some guns like the PPQ fully cock the striker. That doesn't make them unsafe. It's just one layer that's not there. But that's also what gives the PPQ its awesome trigger versus some of the others, because you have to supply some energy when you're pulling this to cock that. But as the trigger moves the rest of the way back, it finally reaches a point where it dips down. And now it's no longer blocking the striker. The striker is fully cocked. It's all the way at the back. This thing dips down. The striker slams forward and the action happens. This little protrusion is what interacts with that piston to push the piston down and disengage the striker block. And it's got a little bit of a ramp. So as you pull the trigger and the bar goes back, it's getting higher and higher on that piston until finally it reaches a point where the piston can no longer interfere with the striker and it fires. At any point, if you let off on the trigger, this all reverses itself and it goes back to its safe position. So most guns with a mechanism similar to this, if you decide at the very last instant not to pull the trigger and let off, then it's back to its normal state. Other guns, you got to be careful that pulling the trigger part way does stage it enough that it may not fully re-enable the safeties, but most of the Glocks, the XDMs, and PPQs do. But that doesn't change the basic safety concept that don't put your finger on the trigger until you actually intend to fire. But there's always that possibility at the last moment I change my mind. So in general, this design or this era of guns does produce, safe guns. Whether you like this or don't, it's all up to you. If you don't mind this, and by the way, I've fired a lot of XDMs, you don't even notice this thing, it just works. I've never had an XDM not fire because this got in the way when I actually had a proper grip. If you're gripping it down here, it doesn't fire, and that's probably a good thing because it's going to flip out of your hand. I have not personally experienced a Sig Sauer negligent discharge or accidental discharge due to that design defect. All of the ones that I've got have been upgraded, but I've also carry a Glock on a daily basis, and I am not worried whatsoever about this thing going off unless I mean it to. So I am comfortable with this. If you're not comfortable with this, then you may want to get one if you're wanting to move a little bit away from, let's say, a 1911 cocked and locked. This might be a good intermediate step, working your way towards it. And there are some variations of the Polymer Wonders, not Glocks, that have a thumb safety in addition to all these safeties. I don't think I'll ever see a Glock with a thumb safety that hasn't been photoshopped, but many of the other guns do offer a thumb safety, no thumb safety version of it. And when you get into some of the older ones like the SIGs, there's different flavors of decocker and various like that. And you can get a SIG 320 with a thumb safety. And actually you can see the casting where that thumb safety would go. This would be cut out and the thumb safety would be in that mechanism. So there are variations on the theme that I've shown you. Now, you've probably heard about the P320 going off if you hit it at the right point with the hammer. Well, I think with the upgrade, I'm kind of confident that they have solved that. And how often do people run around hitting their guns with hammers? Glocks, these things have been dropped out of helicopters. So you're going to hear about Glock leg. You're going to hear about people shooting themselves with a Glock while they're pulling it. With these types of guns, the trigger is the center of the universe. This trigger pulls, they go. And that's basically true of all of this design. The trigger doesn't get pulled, they don't go. So protecting the trigger is critical. And if you've been carrying around, a cocked and locked 1911 style gun, or a little mini version of it, and you throw it in your pocket and you don't worry about the trigger because the safety blocks it, when you have these, you need a holster. There's pocket holsters, there's good inside the waistband holsters. You want to avoid holsters, if you do inside the waistband, that collapse when you pull the gun out, so that when you're going to push it back in, you're trying to go against a collapsed holster. So things like, this IMI, Kydex holster, this is an outside the waistband, but conceptually, the concept is these stay rigid, so your belt will not crush it. And even if you are carrying a 1911 with a thumb safety and no holster, and you've done it your whole life, you might want to reconsider that. It would be easy for the thumb safety to get thumbed off Now you've got a gun that has no additional safeties besides a very light trigger. You should always have a holster, and the key to the holster is it needs to deny access to the trigger. Regardless of the overall design of it, if the holster denies access to the trigger, you're good. The other issue you'll run into is some designs of retention holsters. This is an IMI, and this is not the right holster for this gun. It may fit in there, but you'll see if it goes all the way in, the trigger will be covered by the holster, and the release is down here, but the button I push is up here. And the important piece of that is when I'm trying to pull the gun and I push the button, if I slip off the button or I'm panicking and I get overly, and I don't move my finger in time, where my finger is going to land is on the frame or the ejection port. There is another manufacturer who has chosen to put the button down here, and they also have the additional, what they consider a safety feature, that if you pull the gun first and try to push the button, it won't go. You have to release the tension. So what happens is you get somebody that gets spooked, they need that gun out and they need it out now, and they're strong enough to overcome that as they're pulling. So they're pushing the button real hard, and they're pulling with all they got, and they're pushing and they're pulling, and finally it cuts loose because they managed to break the retention mechanism, and they pull the trigger. So what you'll tend to see is, where you've seen these videos where somebody in a competition scenario has shot themselves in the leg doing a holster draw with one of these outside the waistband holsters of the other design, not this one. It's because of that. So think about your holster. Think about when you draw the gun, where's your finger going to be? And what's going to happen when you're under duress, you need the gun and you need it right now, whether it's a duress created by a timer in a competition or a bad guy standing in front of you, and how would you draw it? I do not have any worries about carrying this, the XDM, the PPQ, even with the fully cocked striker, if I have it with a good holster and I've practiced with that holster. So from a safety perspective, any gun can be safe if used correctly, provided it has the right features, you use them as intended, and you know how to use them. And Hammer was playing around. He had his FNS 9C drawing from a holster, inside the waistband, and was able to draw and fire in 1.7 seconds. And I'm sure there's people there that are faster than that because they, Jerry Michalik, but that is actually pretty quick, and that is going to give you what you need without having to worry about the safeties. And FNS 9C has got the same basic design as any of the ones I just showed you. It's just a different manufacturer's version of it. So hopefully that was kind of helpful in letting you understand a little bit how safeties work, get rid of some of the mysteries about the various components and the striker blocks and how they function, and what with a particular gun is or is not a safe way to handle it. Beyond that, if you like our videos, please give us a thumbs up, share, subscribe, click that bell if you do. Check us out on Patreon, Facebook, Gunstreamer. We're kind of everywhere now. And have a great day. Thank you.